What could make the most feared warriors in medieval Europe turn their dragon ships around and flee back to the safety of the open sea? What force could transform hardened Norse berserkers, men who had terrorized coastlines from Scotland to Sicily, into nervous raiders who spoke in hushed whispers about the Emerald Isle they could never truly conquer? The answer lies hidden in the mists of ancient Ireland, in a story that has been overshadowed by tales of Viking conquest and expansion. A story of warriors so fierce, so intimately connected to their homeland, that they turned the tables on history's most successful raiders and reminded the world that even the mightiest predators can become prey. Picture, if you will, the Europe of the 9th century. From the monasteries of Lindisfarne to the streets of Paris, from the trading posts of Kiev to the walls of Constantinople, one sound strikes terror into the hearts of all who hear it. The rhythmic splash of oars cutting through water, the creak of leather and wood, the low chanting of men who have chosen death over dishonor. The Vikings are coming. These are not merely raiders, but the apex predators of their age. Their longships, technological marvels that can navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, carry them deep into the heart of civilized Europe. Their warriors, raised from birth in a culture that glorifies courage and conquest, fight with a ferocity that breaks enemy lines before the first blow is struck. Their very name becomes synonymous with terror. Their raven banners a symbol of inevitable defeat for those who dare oppose them. By the early 800s, Viking expansion has reached fever pitch. Danish armies winter in England, no longer content with summer raids, but planning permanent conquest. Swedish merchants and warriors push eastward, establishing trading routes that stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Norwegian jarls claim islands scattered across the North Atlantic, their settlements growing into thriving communities that will endure for centuries. Everywhere the Vikings go, they adapt, they overcome, they conquer. They understand that true power lies not just in the strength of their sword arms, but in their ability to exploit the weaknesses of their enemies. They strike where least expected, retreat before superior forces can gather, and return when defences have relaxed. They are masters of psychological warfare, cultivating their fearsome reputation to win battles before they begin. But there is one place where this seemingly unstoppable tide meets something unexpected. One land where the familiar pattern of Viking conquest breaks down into something far more complex and costly. One island where the predators discover they have wandered into the territory of equally dangerous hunters. Ireland in the 9th century is not the unified kingdom that will emerge centuries later. It is a patchwork of rival kingdoms, each ruled by kings who trace their lineage back to mythical heroes and ancient gods. These are the Ui Níl in the north, the Ioganachta in the south, the Laigin in the east, and dozens of smaller kingdoms scattered across the island. They fight each other with the casual brutality of men for whom warfare is both profession and pastime. They raid each other's cattle, burn each other's fortresses, and compete for the title of High King with a ferocity that would make a berserker proud. To the arriving Vikings, this fragmented landscape must have seemed like a gift from the gods, a rich land divided against itself, ripe for conquest by a unified force of professional warriors. They established their first settlements at the mouths of great rivers: Dublin on the Liffey, Cork on the Lee, Waterford on the Swere. These are not temporary raiding bases, but permanent colonies, fortified trading posts that will serve as launching points for the systematic conquest of the island. The initial signs are promising. Irish monasteries, undefended repositories of gold and silver, fall as easily as their counterparts in England and Scotland. Rival Irish kingdoms, more concerned with their ancient feuds than the foreign threat, fail to unite against the newcomers. Viking fleets sail up Irish rivers with impunity, their warriors returning to their longships, laden with plunder and slaves. Yet something is different here. Something that becomes apparent not in the first year or the second, but gradually, like a slow poison working its way through the Norse body politic. The Irish are not behaving like the other peoples the Vikings have encountered. They are not simply submitting to superior force or buying peace with tribute. They are learning, adapting, and most disturbing of all, they are beginning to fight back with a savage effectiveness that catches the invaders off guard. The bogs and forests of Ireland, so different from the open fields where Viking tactics have proven supreme, become hunting grounds where Norse warriors disappear without trace. Irish kings, who initially seemed cowed by Viking raids, begin launching counterattacks of stunning brutality. Most unsettling of all, stories begin to circulate among the Norse settlements of Irish warriors, who fight with a fury that matches their own, who show no fear of death, and who seem to know secrets of warfare that the Vikings have never encountered. In the smoking ruins of a Norse trading post on the Shannon, a runic inscription carved into a wooden post tells a story that would be repeated across Ireland for generations. They came like wolves in the night. We were 30 strong warriors, battle-tested and well-armed. Only 5 lived to see the dawn. The Irish king took no prisoners. He left this message: this land remembers its own. What manner of warriors could inflict such devastation on the terror of Europe? What strategies could overcome the battle-tested tactics that had conquered half the known world? What was it about this Emerald Isle that transformed confident Vikings into nervous settlers who built their walls higher each year and spoke in worried whispers about the kings who ruled the interior? The answer lies in understanding that Ireland was not simply another target for Viking expansion, but a land that had been forging its own unique warrior culture for over 1,000 years. While the Vikings had mastered the art of seaborne warfare, the Irish had perfected something equally deadly: the art of fighting for your homeland with every advantage that intimate knowledge of the terrain could provide. These were not farmers who took up arms in desperation, or knights who fought by the rules of chivalry. These were professional warriors who belonged to a tradition that stretched back to the legendary Tain Bo Cuailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, where heroes like Cu Chulainn had established the template for what an Irish warrior should be. They were men who understood that courage meant nothing without cunning, that strength was useless without speed, and that the greatest victory was not the one that proved your bravery, but the one that sent your enemies fleeing in terror. They were the warriors who would produce Brian Boru, a king who would unite the fractured kingdoms of Ireland under a single banner and lead them to the most decisive victory ever won against Viking forces. They were the men who would fight at Clontarf, where the fate of Ireland would be decided in a single day of bloodshed that would echo through the centuries. They were the forgotten warriors who made even the Vikings run. This is their story. This is the tale of how the Emerald Isle became the graveyard of Norse ambitions, how Irish kings learned to turn the Vikings' own weapons against them, and how a culture that had never known defeat on the open sea discovered what it meant to fight an enemy that knew every stone, every stream, every secret path of the land they called home. But to understand how such a David and Goliath story could unfold, we must first understand the world the Vikings had conquered and the methods they had used to build their empire of fear. Only then can we appreciate the magnitude of what the Irish warriors achieved and why their resistance became the stuff of legend whispered around Norse hearths for generations to come. The stage is set. The players are in position. The greatest confrontation of the Viking Age is about to begin. Part 1. The Viking Tide. The Viking tide that would wash over Ireland began not with a single great invasion, but with a series of probing attacks that gradually escalated into permanent settlement. The first recorded Viking raid on Ireland occurred in 795 AD, when Norse longships struck the monastery on Rathlin Island off the coast of Antrim. The raid followed the familiar pattern that had proven so successful elsewhere. Swift approach under cover of darkness, overwhelming violence against unprepared defenders, and rapid withdrawal with plunder and captives before local forces could respond. But this was merely the beginning. What started as opportunistic, raids soon evolved into something far more systematic and threatening. The Vikings had discovered that Ireland offered advantages that other targets lacked. Unlike the heavily fortified cities of Francia or the organised kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England, Ireland's wealth was scattered across hundreds of undefended monasteries and isolated settlements. The island's fragmented political structure meant that no unified response could be mounted against raiders who struck and vanished like ghosts. Even more enticing was Ireland's geographic position. The island sat at the crossroads of the Viking world, perfectly positioned to serve as a base for operations stretching from Iceland to the Mediterranean. Irish rivers penetrated deep into the interior, providing highways for longships to reach targets far from the coast. The mild climate and fertile soil promised rich agricultural lands for permanent settlement. Most importantly, Ireland's location made it an ideal staging ground for raids on the wealthy kingdoms of Wales, Scotland, and Western England. By 840 AD, the nature of Viking activity in Ireland had fundamentally changed. These were no longer seasonal raids, but permanent settlements, fortified bases that the Irish would come to call long forts. The most important of these was established at the mouth of the River Liffey, where a natural ford had long served as a crossing point for inland travellers. The Vikings called this place Dublin, the Black Pool, though the Irish knew it by the older name of Baal Atha Cliath, the town of the hurdled ford. From this base, which would grow into the city of Dublin, Viking influence spread like ink through water. Similar settlements sprang up at the mouths of other major rivers: Cork on the Lee, Waterford on the Swere, Wexford on the Slaney, and Limerick on the Shannon. Each followed the same strategic pattern, positioned where river met sea, providing both inland access and escape routes to the open ocean. Heavily fortified with earthworks and wooden palisades, garrisoned by professional warriors, and supported by a growing population of traders, craftsmen, and farmers. The man who oversaw this transformation of Ireland's Viking presence was not a king or jarl in the traditional sense, but something new. Turgesius, a warlord who claimed authority over all Norse activities in Ireland. The Irish annals remember him as Turgesius, describing him as a man of exceptional ambition, who saw Ireland not as a source of plunder, but as a kingdom to be conquered and ruled. Turgesius established his capital at Dublin and proclaimed himself king of all the foreigners in Ireland. His wife, Ota, was said to have given pagan oracles from the high altar of the monastery at Clonmacnoise, one of Ireland's most sacred sites. This was not mere sacrilege, but a calculated insult designed to demonstrate Norse dominance over Irish Christianity and culture. The Vikings were no longer content to raid and retreat. They intended to rule. The scale of this transformation was staggering. Archaeological evidence from Dublin reveals a bustling international trading centre by the mid-9th century, with artefacts from Scandinavia, Britain, Francia, and even the distant markets of the Middle East. The Vikings had brought with them not just weapons and longships, but an entire commercial network that stretched across the known world. Irish, silver, cattle, and slaves flowed outward, while foreign goods, ideas, and technologies flowed back. For the Irish kingdoms, this presented an entirely new type of challenge. Previous threats had come from neighbouring Irish kings seeking to expand their territories or claim the high kingship. These conflicts, while often brutal, followed understood patterns. They were fought between armies that shared similar equipment, tactics, and cultural assumptions. Most importantly, they were finite conflicts that ended in victory, defeat, or negotiated settlement. The Vikings represented something fundamentally different. They were not seeking to claim traditional Irish territories or assert ancient rights of kingship. They were establishing an entirely parallel power structure that challenged the very foundations of Irish society. Their settlements served as magnets for trade and craft work, drawing economic activity away from traditional Irish centres. Their military technology and tactics gave them significant advantages in open combat. Most disturbing of all, they showed no intention of leaving or accepting subordinate status within existing Irish political structures. Initially, many Irish kings attempted to treat the Vikings as they would any other external threat. King Niall Caya of the Uí Níl led several campaigns against Viking settlements, scoring notable victories that temporarily disrupted Norse activities. In 845 AD, he captured and executed Turgesius himself, displaying the Viking leader's head as proof that these foreign warriors were not invincible. Similar successes were achieved by other Irish kings who recognized the threat early and responded with decisive action. But these victories, impressive as they were, failed to address the fundamental problem. The Vikings were not a single warband that could be defeated in battle and dispersed. They were part of an international network that could replace losses, send reinforcements, and establish new bases faster than the Irish could destroy them. When one Viking leader was killed, another would arrive from Norway or Denmark to take his place. When one settlement was burned, its survivors would retreat to another fortified base and begin planning their return. The Irish began to realise they were fighting not just against individual Viking forces, but against an entire system of expansion and settlement that had already proven successful across much of northern Europe. The same tactics that had conquered much of England and established Norse kingdoms in Scotland were now being applied to Ireland with methodical precision. By 860 AD, the Viking presence in Ireland had become permanent and politically significant. Norse kings in Dublin were minting their own coins, establishing their own laws, and conducting diplomatic relations with other Viking rulers as equals. They had constructed a chain of fortified settlements that controlled Ireland's most important waterways and trade routes. Most ominously, they had begun to interfere in Irish politics, supporting some kings against others in exchange for tribute and territorial concessions. The traditional Irish response to this crisis was predictable. The kings turned on each other. Rather than uniting against the foreign threat, they competed to see who could best exploit Viking military power for their own purposes. Some Irish kings hired Viking mercenaries to fight against their Irish enemies. Others formed alliances with Norse leaders, offering tribute in exchange for protection against rival kingdoms. A few even married their daughters to Viking chiefs, hoping to secure favourable terms through kinship bonds. This fragmentation played directly into Viking strengths. The Norse were master negotiators who understood how to exploit political divisions among their enemies. They had perfected these techniques in England, where they had successfully turned Anglo-Saxon kingdoms against each other. In Ireland, they found an even more promising situation. A land where political unity was seen as temporary at best, and where kings were always willing to consider new alliances that might provide advantages over their neighbours. The Vikings seemed to have found the perfect formula for conquest. They would establish fortified bases at strategic locations, use their superior military technology to dominate local conflicts, and gradually expand their influence through a combination of force and diplomacy. Their successes in Ireland mirrored their achievements elsewhere. What had worked in York would work in Dublin. What had succeeded in Normandy would succeed in Cork. Yet even at the height of their apparent success, perceptive Vikings began to notice disturbing signs. Unlike their conquests elsewhere, Ireland was not gradually submitting to Norse rule. Instead, resistance was intensifying in ways that defied their previous experience. Irish kings who had initially sought accommodation with the Vikings were beginning to change their approach, adopting new strategies that seemed designed specifically to counter Norse advantages. In the hills and forests beyond the reach of Viking settlements, something was stirring. Irish warriors were learning lessons from their defeats, adapting their tactics, and preparing for a different kind of war. The fragmented kingdoms that had seemed like such a weakness were beginning to forge new alliances based not on ancient kinship claims, but on a shared recognition that the Viking presence threatened their entire way of life. The tide that had carried Viking expansion across Europe was about to encounter something it had never faced before. A people who understood that their survival depended not on accommodation with the invaders, but on making the cost of conquest so high that even the most determined enemies would eventually give up and seek easier prey elsewhere. In the royal halls of Irish kingdoms, in the sacred groves where druids still whispered ancient wisdom, in the training grounds where young warriors learned to wield sword and spear, a new determination was taking shape. The Vikings had brought the methods that had conquered half of Europe to the shores of Ireland. Now they were about to discover what happened when those methods met a people who had been fighting for their homeland since before the Romans came to Britain. The real war was about to begin. To understand how the Irish would ultimately turn the tables on the Vikings, we must first understand the land itself. Ireland was not simply another European battlefield where opposing armies could clash in the open field. It was a landscape so uniquely suited to defensive warfare that it might have been designed by the gods themselves to frustrate foreign invaders. Imagine, if you will, the Ireland of the 9th century. This is not the drained and cultivated Ireland of later centuries, but a primeval wilderness where vast stretches of bog and forest stretch unbroken to the horizon, where every valley holds its secrets and every hill offers both refuge and vantage point, where the very ground beneath your feet might be solid earth or treacherous marsh that could swallow a man and his horse without trace. The bogs alone covered nearly a quarter of the island, creating a maze of waterlogged terrain that was navigable only by those who knew its secrets. These were not simple swamps, but complex ecosystems where the unwary could become lost for days, where solid-looking ground could suddenly give way to pools of black water deep enough to drown an armoured warrior. The Vikings, accustomed to the relatively predictable terrain of Denmark and Norway, found themselves in a landscape that seemed actively hostile to their presence. But what the Vikings saw as obstacles, the Irish saw as opportunities. For over 1,000 years, Irish warriors had been learning to read the subtle signs that distinguished safe passage from deadly trap. They knew which patches of bright green moss indicated solid ground, and which marked bog holes that could swallow a horse. They understood how the morning mist clung to dangerous areas, how the flight patterns of birds revealed hidden paths, how the very smell of the wind could warn of approaching weather that would make travel impossible. More importantly, the Irish had developed an entire military doctrine based on exploiting these environmental advantages. While Viking tactics relied on the shield wall, the disciplined advance, and the decisive clash of arms, Irish warfare was built around mobility, surprise, and the intimate knowledge of terrain that could turn any pursuit into a death trap. The Irish warrior was not a heavily armoured knight who fought from horseback or a disciplined infantryman who stood in formation. He was something uniquely adapted to his environment, a light, armed fighter who could move swiftly across terrain that would stop a conventional army, who could strike without warning and disappear into landscape that offered 1,000 hiding places, who could lead pursuing enemies into ground of his choosing where their superior numbers and equipment counted for nothing. This transformation of the landscape into a weapon was perhaps most dramatically demonstrated in the great forests that covered much of inland Ireland. These were not the managed woodlands of later centuries, but ancient wildwood, where massive oaks created a canopy so thick that noon could seem like twilight. Where undergrowth grew so dense that a man could pass within arm's reach of an enemy and never see him. Where every tree, every fallen log, every stream and gully was a potential ambush site. The Irish had been fighting in these forests for generations, learning to use the environment in ways that would have seemed impossible to foreign observers. They developed techniques for moving silently through undergrowth that would betray any ordinary warrior. They learned to use the acoustic properties of dense forest to their advantage, creating sounds that would draw enemies into carefully prepared traps. They mastered the art of the forest ambush, where a handful of Irish warriors could devastate a much larger force by attacking from concealment and melting away before retaliation was possible. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the sophisticated nature of Irish forest warfare. Hidden weapon caches have been discovered at strategic locations, allowing Irish warbands to arm themselves quickly when opportunities arose. Trail markers invisible to foreign eyes, but clear to those who knew their meaning, have been found carved into trees along ancient paths. Most tellingly, the remains of Viking warriors have been found in locations that suggest they were led into deliberate ambushes, killed far from any obvious objective by enemies who knew exactly where to strike. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of Irish environmental warfare was the way it neutralised the Vikings' greatest advantages. The longship that had carried Norse warriors to victory across Europe was useless in the Irish interior. The heavy armour and disciplined formations that had broken enemy lines from England to Constantinople became liabilities in terrain where mobility and individual skill mattered more than collective strength. Consider the fate of a Viking expedition recorded in the Annals of Ulster for the year 863. A force of 200 Norse warriors, led by a seasoned commander named Olaf the White, set out from Dublin to capture the monastery at Glendalough, nestled in the mountains of Wicklow. The expedition was well equipped and confident, following what appeared to be a clear path through the hills toward their objective. The Irish response was masterly in its simplicity. Rather than meet the Vikings in open battle, the local king, Murkertach mac Diarmata, ordered his warriors to retreat before the advancing Norse force, leaving behind what appeared to be a trail of abandoned camps and hastily extinguished fires. The Vikings, interpreting this as evidence of enemy fear, pressed forward eagerly, convinced that they were pursuing a beaten foe. What they were actually following was a carefully planned route that led them away from the main paths and deeper into the most treacherous terrain of the Wicklow Mountains. The Irish had prepared their ground with meticulous care, removing trail markers that might have warned the Vikings of danger, creating false paths that led toward impassable terrain, and establishing supply caches that would allow Irish warriors to maintain their pursuit far from any settled areas. The trap was sprung in a narrow valley where the path appeared to widen toward easier ground. As the Viking column stretched out along the track, Irish warriors emerged from concealment on the slopes above. But this was not a conventional ambush. The Irish had positioned themselves so that the Vikings could not form their traditional shield wall, could not retreat to defensible ground, and could not use their superior numbers effectively. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. The Vikings found themselves fighting on ground where every advantage lay with their enemies. Irish warriors, moving with the fluid grace of men who had trained in this exact terrain since childhood, struck and vanished like ghosts. They used the steep slopes to launch attacks from above, then melted away before the Vikings could organize a response. They drove the surviving Norse warriors deeper into the valley, where the ground became progressively more difficult and the possibilities for escape increasingly limited. Of the 200 Vikings who had left Dublin in confident expectation of easy victory, fewer than 30 returned. The remainder were either killed in the fighting or lost in the mountains, their bodies never recovered. The monastery at Glendalough remained untouched, its treasures intact, its monks free to continue their work of preserving Irish culture and learning. More significantly, word of this disaster spread rapidly through the Viking settlements. The Norse had encountered something they had never faced before, an enemy who could use the very ground beneath their feet as a weapon more deadly than any sword. The psychological impact was profound. Viking commanders began to view expeditions into the Irish interior not as opportunities for easy plunder, but as dangerous ventures that might cost them their entire force. The Irish, meanwhile, learned valuable lessons from each encounter. They developed an informal but effective intelligence network that could track Viking movements and coordinate responses across multiple kingdoms. They refined their tactics based on what worked best against different types of Norse forces. Most importantly, they began to share knowledge and techniques, spreading successful strategies from one kingdom to another with remarkable speed. This sharing of tactical knowledge was facilitated by Ireland's unique cultural institutions. The island's network of monasteries served not just as centres of learning and worship, but as communication hubs where information could be passed rapidly across political boundaries. The bardic schools, where poets and storytellers preserved Irish history and culture, became repositories of military knowledge as well as literary tradition. The seasonal gatherings where kings met to settle disputes and arrange marriages also served as forums for discussing the most effective methods of fighting the Viking threat. Perhaps most importantly, the Irish developed a new understanding of how to use their political fragmentation as a military advantage. Rather than seeing the island's many kingdoms as a weakness, they began to recognize that this very division made it impossible for the Vikings to achieve decisive victory. A Norse force that defeated one Irish king would soon find itself facing another, each with intimate knowledge of different terrain and different tactical approaches. The Vikings had succeeded elsewhere through a combination of superior technology, disciplined tactics, and the ability to exploit political divisions among their enemies. In Ireland, they found that their technological advantages were neutralized by terrain that favored the lighter-armed Irish warrior. Their disciplined tactics were ineffective against enemies who refused to fight on their terms. Most frustrating of all, their attempts to exploit Irish political divisions only served to push the fractured kingdoms toward new forms of cooperation, based on mutual recognition of the Viking threat. By the 870s, the nature of the conflict had fundamentally changed. The Vikings still controlled their fortified settlements and dominated the waterways that connected them. But the Irish interior had become a no-man's land where Norse expeditions ventured at their peril. The easy victories that had marked the early years of Viking expansion in Ireland were increasingly rare, replaced by costly campaigns that yielded little profit and high casualties. The Irish had discovered something that would prove crucial in the battles to come: that superior weapons and armour meant nothing if you could not bring them to bear effectively. That numerical superiority was worthless if the enemy could choose when and where to fight. That the most successful military strategy was often the one that refused to play by the enemy's rules. In the royal halls of Irish kingdoms, a new confidence was emerging. The Vikings were no longer seen as invincible conquerors, but as skilled enemies who could be defeated by those who understood how to use Ireland's unique advantages. The stage was being set for a new phase of the conflict, one where Irish warriors would prove that the Emerald Isle bred fighters every bit as fierce as the berserkers of the north. But to understand the full magnitude of what was coming, we must look beyond tactics and terrain to the warriors themselves. For the Irish had not merely learned to fight in their homeland. They had forged a warrior culture that would produce some of the most feared fighters in medieval Europe. Men who combined the tactical innovations of environmental warfare with a spiritual and cultural tradition that made them as psychologically devastating as they were militarily effective. The Vikings were about to discover that they had awakened something in the Irish that would haunt their settlements for generations to come. To understand the warriors who would ultimately break Viking power in Ireland, we must look beyond their tactical innovations to the culture that forged them. For the Irish had not simply learned to fight effectively, they had created a warrior society that matched the Vikings' own fierce traditions while adding elements that would prove psychologically devastating to their Norse enemies. At the heart of Irish warrior culture was an institution that had no equivalent in the Viking world, the fianna. These were not merely war bands or household troops, but something far more sophisticated and demanding. The fianna were elite warrior societies that existed outside the normal structure of Irish kingdoms, bound by oaths of loyalty to each other and to a code of conduct that prized courage, skill, and honour above all else. Entry into the fianna was not a matter of noble birth or political connection, but of proven ability under the most demanding conditions. A young man seeking to join had to demonstrate not just martial prowess, but a range of skills that would have impressed even the most accomplished Viking warrior. He had to show that he could compose poetry extemporaneously, for the Irish believed that a true warrior must be as skilled with words as with weapons. He had to prove his knowledge of genealogy and law, demonstrating that he understood the complex web of relationships and obligations that bound Irish society together. Most critically, he had to survive a series of physical tests that would have broken lesser men. The candidate would be placed in a bog hole up to his waist, armed only with a shield and a hazel stick, while 9 warriors hurled spears at him from a distance of 9 ridges. If he was wounded, he failed. He had to outrun pursuers through the forest without breaking a branch underfoot, without having his hair disturbed by a hanging bough, without having his weapons tremble in his hands. He had to leap over a barrier the height of his forehead, pass under one as low as his knee, and pluck a thorn from his foot while running at full speed, all without slowing his pace. These tests were not mere ritual ordeals, but practical preparations for the type of warfare the fianna would face. The Irish had recognised that fighting in their homeland required warriors who combined physical prowess with mental agility, who could think quickly under pressure, who could move through difficult terrain with supernatural grace. The Fianna system produced men who were not just fighters, but artists of war, capable of feats that would seem impossible to ordinary soldiers. The psychological impact of encountering such warriors was profound. Viking berserkers were accustomed to intimidating their enemies through displays of ferocity and apparent invulnerability. They would work themselves into battle frenzy, foam at the mouth, and charge into combat with wild abandon. Against most enemies, this psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. But the Irish Fianna had their own traditions of battle fury that were equally terrifying and far more controlled. The Irish warrior entering battle was a sight that would have unnerved even the most experienced Viking. His hair was bleached with lime until it stood out from his head like a golden mane. His body was painted with woad in intricate patterns that identified his clan and his achievements. His weapons were not just tools of war, but works of art, their hilts and blades decorated with intricate Celtic knotwork that seemed to writhe and move in the flickering light of battle. But it was the sound of the Irish war cry that truly marked them as something beyond ordinary warriors. The Viking battle roar was meant to intimidate through sheer volume and ferocity. The Irish war cry was something different, a complex harmony of voices that began as a low humming and built to a crescendo that could be heard for miles. It was not just sound but music, a battlefield symphony that spoke of a warrior tradition stretching back to the heroes of legend. This was the cry that had echoed across the plains of Moytura when the Tuatha De Danann fought the Fomorians in the mythical battles that shaped the Irish landscape. It was the sound that had accompanied Cu Chulainn as he defended Ulster against the armies of Connacht. It was the voice of a people who had been fighting for their homeland since before the Romans came to Britain, who had faced down armies and monsters and gods themselves. The effect on Viking morale was devastating. Norse warriors who had faced the shield walls of Saxon kings without flinching found themselves unnerved by enemies who seemed to draw their strength from the very land they defended. The Irish did not just fight for plunder or glory, but for something deeper, for the sacred hills where their ancestors were buried, for the holy wells where their gods had walked, for the ancient stones that marked the boundaries of their world. This spiritual dimension of Irish warfare was perhaps the most alien aspect of their culture to Viking understanding. The Norse were certainly not lacking in religious fervour, but their spiritual practices were typically confined to specific rituals and occasions. The Irish, by contrast, seemed to live in a world where the supernatural was constantly present, where every hill and stream held its own spirits, where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin and permeable. Irish warriors carried into battle not just weapons, but talismans and amulets that were believed to provide protection and power. They consulted druids and Philid, poets who were also seers, who could read omens in the flight of birds or the patterns of clouds. They fought on ground that was sacred to them, where every stone circle and holy well reminded them that they were part of an unbroken tradition stretching back to the beginning of time. The psychological warfare extended beyond the battlefield to the very appearance of Irish settlements and fortifications, where Viking strongholds were built for practical defence, with straight walls and geometric layouts. Irish fortifications seemed designed to unnerve and confuse. The great hill forts that dotted the Irish landscape were not just military installations, but sacred sites where the boundaries between the human and divine worlds were deliberately blurred. Consider the experience of a Viking warrior approaching the hill fort of Tara, the traditional seat of the High Kings of Ireland. This was not simply a fortress, but a complex of earthworks, burial mounds, and stone circles that had been accumulating spiritual significance for over 1,000 years. The very ground seemed to pulse with power, marked by standing stones covered in Ogham script that most Vikings could not read, but which seemed to watch them with malevolent intelligence. The Irish defenders of such places were not merely fighting for strategic positions, but for the spiritual heart of their world. They drew strength from the knowledge that they stood where countless generations of their ancestors had stood, where the gods themselves had walked, where the very stones bore witness to their courage or cowardice. This was not a motivation that Vikings, for all their own fierce traditions, could easily understand or counter. The Irish warrior's relationship with death was equally alien to Viking sensibilities. The Norse certainly glorified death in battle, with their beliefs about Valhalla and the Einherjar who would fight at Ragnarok. But this was a relatively straightforward transaction. Die bravely in battle, gain eternal glory and a place in Odin's hall. The Irish relationship with death was more complex and, in many ways, more disturbing to their enemies. Irish warriors spoke of the Sidhe, the fairy mounds where the spirits of the dead continued their existence in a parallel world that occasionally intersected with the realm of the living. They believed that warriors who died defending their homeland might return to aid their descendants in times of great need. They practiced rituals that were meant to ensure that the dead would remember their obligations to the living, that the spirits of fallen heroes would continue to fight for Ireland even after their bodies had returned to the earth. This belief system created warriors who seemed to have an almost supernatural fearlessness in battle. They fought not just for their own glory, but for the approval of countless ancestral spirits who watched from the other world. They knew that cowardice would shame not just themselves, but their entire lineage, stretching back to the legendary heroes of the Táin. They understood that courage in battle was not just a personal virtue, but a sacred duty that connected them to the divine forces that shaped their world. The tactical implications of this mindset were profound. Irish warriors would undertake desperate enterprises that Vikings would have considered suicidal, not out of reckless bravery, but from a calm certainty that some things were worth dying for. They would hold impossible positions, launch hopeless attacks, and refuse to surrender even when defeat was inevitable, because they believed that the manner of their death would determine their fate in the other world. Perhaps most unsettling to Viking psychology was the Irish practice of taking heads as trophies. The Norse certainly collected battle trophies, but their approach to enemy dead was relatively straightforward. Strip them of valuables, perhaps mutilate them as a warning to others, but then leave them for the carrion birds. The Irish treatment of enemy dead was more complex and ritually significant in ways that deeply disturbed their Viking opponents. Irish warriors would take the heads of fallen enemies, not merely as trophies, but as sources of power and wisdom. They believed that the head was the seat of the soul, that it retained its consciousness and knowledge even after death. A warrior who possessed the head of a brave enemy could gain access to his courage and skill. A king who displayed the heads of his enemies was not just demonstrating his military prowess, but literally accumulating spiritual power that would aid him in future conflicts. The sight of Irish warriors carrying the severed heads of their comrades, still dripping with blood and carefully preserved according to ancient rituals, was profoundly unsettling to Vikings who thought they had seen every form of battlefield horror. These were not simple barbarians reveling in carnage, but practitioners of a spiritual tradition that treated death as a doorway to greater power rather than a final ending. The cumulative effect of all these factors was to create warriors who were not just militarily effective, but psychologically devastating to their enemies. Vikings, who had terrorized half of Europe, found themselves facing opponents who seemed to emerge from their worst nightmares. Warriors who fought like demons, who drew strength from the very ground they defended, who treated death as a friend rather than an enemy, who seemed to have the backing of supernatural forces that no amount of conventional courage could overcome. The Irish had discovered something that would prove crucial in the battles to come. That warfare was not just about tactics and weapons, but about the will to fight, about the stories that warriors told themselves, about who they were and what they were fighting for. They had created a warrior culture that could match Viking ferocity while adding elements that the Norse found deeply disturbing and impossible to counter. By the late 9th century, the psychological balance of the conflict had begun to shift. Viking raids into Irish territory were no longer the confident expeditions of earlier decades, but nervous ventures into a landscape that seemed actively hostile to their presence. Norse warriors spoke in hushed tones of Irish kings who could call down curses upon their enemies, of Celtic warriors who fought with the fury of the gods themselves, of a people who seemed to have made the very land their ally in the struggle against foreign invaders. But the Irish were not content to simply defend their homeland through superior tactics and psychological warfare. They had learned valuable lessons from their encounters with the Vikings, lessons that would soon produce leaders capable of turning the tables completely. The stage was being set for the emergence of a new type of Irish king, one who would combine the ancient warrior traditions of his people with the strategic innovations needed to unite Ireland's fractured kingdoms against the Viking threat. The fire of Celtic warriors was about to be forged into a weapon that would reshape the balance of power in the medieval world. Part 4. The High King's Vision. In the year 976 AD, in the Kingdom of Munster in southwestern Ireland, a man came to power who would transform the entire nature of the Irish Viking conflict. His name was Brian Boru, though he would not be known by that title for many years. To his enemies, he was simply Brian mac Senetig, the son of a minor king whose realm had been repeatedly ravaged by Viking raids. To his followers, he was something far more significant, the leader who would finally unite Ireland's fractured kingdoms under a single banner and drive the Norse invaders back to the sea. But Brian Boru was not simply another Irish king seeking to expand his territory through traditional warfare. He was a strategic innovator who understood that defeating the Vikings would require more than battlefield courage or environmental advantages. It would demand a fundamental restructuring of Irish society, a new approach to warfare that combined the ancient strengths of Celtic warriors with tactics specifically designed to counter Viking advantages. Brian's rise to power began in tragedy. His older brother, Mathgamain, had been King of Munster and one of the most successful Irish leaders in the fight against Viking expansion. In 976 AD, Mathgamain was betrayed and murdered by rivals within his own kingdom, men who had been convinced by Norse agents that accommodation with the Vikings offered better prospects than continued resistance. The assassination was meant to eliminate the most dangerous threat to Viking dominance in southern Ireland. Instead, it created something far more dangerous. A leader who understood that the traditional Irish approach to dealing with foreign invaders was fatally flawed. Brian had watched his brother struggle against enemies who could exploit Irish political divisions, who could turn kingdom against kingdom, who could always find Irish allies willing to betray their own people for short-term advantage. He had seen how the fragmented nature of Irish society which had been a source of strength in earlier times, had become a fatal weakness in the face of a unified, systematic enemy. Brian's first actions as king revealed a strategic mind that would have impressed even the most skilled Viking commanders. Rather than immediately seeking vengeance for his brother's death, he spent months carefully analysing the political situation in Munster. He identified which nobles could be trusted, which ones were secretly in league with the Vikings, and which ones might be turned to his cause through the right combination of incentives and threats. When he finally moved against his brother's killers, it was not with the hot-blooded fury of a traditional Irish warrior, but with the cold calculation of a general who understood that every action must serve a larger strategic purpose. He eliminated the traitors not just to satisfy honour, but to send a clear message to every nobleman in Ireland. Collaboration with the Vikings would no longer be tolerated or rewarded. More significantly, Brian began to implement a new model of kingship that departed radically from Irish tradition. Where previous Irish kings had been content to rule their own territories and compete with their neighbours for temporary supremacy, Brian envisioned something unprecedented: a truly unified Ireland under a single high king who could coordinate resistance against the Viking threat across the entire island. This vision required more than military conquest. It demanded a complete rethinking of how Irish society organised itself for war. Brian understood that the Vikings' greatest advantage lay not in their individual prowess, but in their ability to coordinate activities across vast distances, to concentrate forces at critical points, and to maintain supply lines that could support extended campaigns. If the Irish were to defeat them, they would need to match this organisational capability while retaining their own advantages in environmental knowledge and warrior culture. Brian's approach to achieving this unity was masterful in its subtlety. Rather than simply conquering neighbouring kingdoms, he offered them a new model of political relationship based on mutual benefit rather than domination. He proposed that Irish kings who joined his alliance would retain their traditional authority within their own territories while contributing to a coordinated defence against foreign threats. This was a radical departure from the winner-take-all model that had previously governed Irish politics. The economic dimension of Brian's strategy was equally innovative. He recognised that the Vikings' power in Ireland rested not just on military force, but on their control of trade routes and commercial networks. The Norse settlements at Dublin, Cork, and Waterford were not just military bases, but economic powerhouses that generated the wealth needed to support Viking expansion. If these could be disrupted or captured, the entire Norse position in Ireland would become untenable. Brian began by establishing alternative trade routes that bypassed Viking-controlled ports. He negotiated directly with merchants from Wales, Scotland, and even continental Europe, offering them safe passage through Irish territory in exchange for trading agreements that excluded Viking middlemen. This was economic warfare of a sophistication that few medieval rulers had attempted, a systematic effort to undermine enemy power through commercial pressure rather than military confrontation. At the same time, Brian was revolutionising Irish military organisation. The traditional Irish approach to warfare had been based on individual kingdoms mustering their own forces for specific campaigns, with little coordination between different armies. Brian created something unprecedented, a unified command structure that could coordinate the activities of multiple kingdoms simultaneously. This required not just military innovation, but cultural transformation. Brian had to convince kings who had been enemies for generations to work together against a common threat. He had to create new systems of communication that could coordinate activities across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Most challenging of all, he had to forge a new sense of Irish identity that transcended the ancient tribal divisions that had defined the island's politics for centuries. The process was neither quick nor easy. Brian's early attempts at creating a unified Irish kingdom met with fierce resistance from traditional rivals who saw his rise as a threat to their own power. The Uí Níl kings of the north, who had long claimed the high kingship of Ireland, were particularly hostile to Brian's ambitions. They formed alliances with Viking forces specifically to prevent the emergence of a unified Irish state under Munster leadership. But Brian's strategic patience and political skill gradually began to pay dividends. He demonstrated that alliance with him offered tangible benefits that traditional Irish political arrangements could not match. Kings who joined his confederation found their territories better protected against Viking raids. Their trade prospered under the new economic arrangements Brian had negotiated. Their warriors gained access to better weapons and equipment through Brian's systematic efforts to improve Irish military technology. Perhaps most importantly, Brian offered something that no previous Irish leader had been able to provide: a realistic prospect of final victory over the Viking threat. For generations, Irish kings had been fighting a defensive war, scoring occasional victories but never achieving anything decisive. Brian presented a vision of offensive action that could drive the Vikings from Ireland entirely and establish Irish independence on a permanent basis. The transformation of Brian from a local king to a national leader was not just a political phenomenon, but a cultural one. Irish bards and storytellers began to spread tales of his achievements, connecting him to the legendary heroes of Irish mythology. He was portrayed not just as a successful warrior, but as a figure destined to restore Ireland to its ancient glory, to reunite the island under native rule for the first time in centuries. This propaganda campaign was carefully calculated to appeal to Irish cultural values while undermining Viking prestige. Brian was presented as the rightful heir to the High Kings of legend, the leader who would fulfill ancient prophecies about the restoration of Irish independence. The Vikings, by contrast, were portrayed as temporary interlopers whose time in Ireland was coming to an end. The psychological impact of this campaign was profound. Irish warriors, who had grown up hearing stories of Viking invincibility, began to believe that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. Viking settlers, who had considered their position in Ireland secure, began to worry about their long-term prospects. The Norse alliance system, which had relied heavily on convincing Irish kings that accommodation was preferable to resistance, began to crumble as more and more Irish leaders concluded that Brian offered a better path to power and prosperity. By the year 1000 CE, Brian's patient strategy had achieved remarkable success. He had united most of southern and western Ireland under his direct rule or alliance system. He had established alternative trade networks that were beginning to challenge Viking commercial dominance. Most significantly, he had created a unified military command that could coordinate Irish resistance across the entire island for the first time in centuries. The Vikings, for their part, had begun to recognize the magnitude of the threat they faced. This was not another Irish king seeking to expand his territory through traditional warfare, but a leader who had systematically addressed every weakness in Irish society that had previously made Viking expansion possible. Brian had created something that the Norse had never faced before: a unified, coordinated, and strategically sophisticated enemy that could match their own organizational capabilities while retaining all the advantages of fighting on familiar ground. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of Ireland. Brian had spent decades preparing for this moment, building alliances, developing new strategies, and creating the organizational infrastructure needed to support a decisive campaign against Viking power. The Norse, sensing the growing threat, began to marshal their own resources for what they recognized would be a final test of their position in Ireland. But Brian's vision extended beyond simply defeating the Vikings in battle. He understood that true victory would require not just military success, but the creation of a new model of Irish society that could prevent future foreign invasions. He had seen how Irish political fragmentation had made the island vulnerable to Viking expansion. He was determined to create a unified Irish state that could stand as an equal among the kingdoms of medieval Europe. The collision between Brian's vision of a unified Ireland and the Viking determination to maintain their Irish empire would soon produce the most decisive battle in Irish history. At Clontarf, on the shores of Dublin Bay, the fate of Ireland would be decided in a single day of bloodshed that would echo through the centuries. But the battle itself would be only the culmination of a far more complex struggle between two fundamentally different visions of what Ireland should become. Brian Boru had transformed himself from a local king into a national leader, from a traditional Irish warrior into a strategic innovator who understood that the future belonged to those who could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving the essential strengths of their culture. The Vikings were about to discover that they had awakened not just another Irish enemy, but a force that could challenge the very foundations of their Irish empire. The High King's vision was about to be tested in the crucible of battle, and the outcome would determine whether Ireland would remain divided and vulnerable or emerge as a unified nation capable of defending its independence against any future threat. Part 5. When Worlds Collide. But to understand the full intensity of the coming confrontation, we must look beyond military strategy and political maneuvering to the deeper cultural forces that made this conflict so personal and devastating. The struggle between Brian Boru's Irish Confederation and the Viking settlers was not simply a territorial dispute or a clash of competing armies. It was a collision between two fundamentally different ways of understanding the world, two incompatible visions of how society should be organized, two radically different relationships with the divine forces that shaped human destiny. At the heart of this cultural collision lay the most fundamental question of all: what it meant to be a king. To the Vikings, kingship was essentially a military position, earned through prowess in battle and maintained through the continued loyalty of warriors who followed their leader in exchange for plunder and glory. A Viking king was first and foremost a war leader, a man who could inspire his followers to risk their lives for the promise of wealth and honour. His authority was practical and immediate, based on his ability to deliver success in the raids and battles that defined Norse existence. The Irish concept of kingship was something far more complex and sacred. An Irish king was not merely a military commander, but a mystical figure whose very presence was believed to influence the fertility of the land, the success of the harvest, and the prosperity of his people. The ritual of kingship in Ireland included ceremonies that would have seemed bizarre and blasphemous to Viking observers. The symbolic marriage of the king to the land itself, represented by a goddess whose favour was essential for the kingdom's survival. This sacred dimension of Irish kingship was embodied in the elaborate inauguration ceremonies that marked the beginning of a new reign. The king would be brought to ancient sites where countless generations of his predecessors had been crowned, places where the boundary between the human and divine worlds was thin and permeable. He would undergo rituals that connected him to the mythical heroes of Irish legend, ceremonies that transformed him from a mere mortal into a channel for the supernatural forces that protected his people. The Vikings, with their relatively straightforward approach to leadership, found these elaborate ceremonies both incomprehensible and threatening. They had encountered kings across Europe who claimed divine sanction for their rule, but the Irish relationship with the sacred realm was more intimate and direct than anything in their previous experience. Irish kings didn't simply claim to rule by divine right. They seemed to believe that they were literally connected to the gods, that their personal conduct could influence the natural world itself. This difference in the understanding of kingship had profound implications for how the two cultures approached the question of loyalty and allegiance. Viking warriors swore oaths to their leaders based on mutual obligation. The king would provide opportunities for wealth and glory, while the warriors would offer their service and courage in return. This was a practical arrangement that could be dissolved if either party failed to fulfill their obligations. Irish loyalty was based on something deeper and more complex. The relationship between an Irish king and his people was not just political, but spiritual, bound up with ancient concepts of kinship, honour, and connection to the land that had sustained their ancestors for countless generations. An Irish warrior didn't simply serve his king, he served the embodiment of everything his people held sacred, the living representative of the gods who had shaped the Irish landscape and watched over its inhabitants since the beginning of time. This spiritual dimension of Irish loyalty created warriors who would fight with a desperation that Vikings found difficult to understand. Norse warriors certainly valued courage and honour, but they also understood the practical limits of what could be accomplished through individual heroism. They would retreat when faced with impossible odds, regroup when their position became untenable, and live to fight another day when circumstances were more favourable. Irish warriors, fighting for a king who represented not just political authority, but the sacred essence of their homeland, would undertake desperate enterprises that Vikings considered suicidal. They would hold hopeless positions, launch attacks against overwhelming odds, and refuse to surrender even when defeat was inevitable, because they believed that their king's sacred nature demanded nothing less than total commitment. The religious dimension of the conflict added another layer of complexity to the cultural collision. By the 10th century, both the Irish and the Vikings were nominally Christian, but their approaches to the faith were so different that they might as well have been following entirely different religions. The Vikings had embraced Christianity relatively recently and in a characteristically practical manner. They appreciated the organizational advantages of Christian monarchy, the diplomatic benefits of sharing a religion with their trading partners, and the military utility of having priests who could serve as administrators and record keepers. But their Christianity retained strong elements of their earlier Norse paganism, particularly in their approach to warfare and their understanding of fate and destiny. Irish Christianity, by contrast, was one of the oldest and most sophisticated expressions of the faith in medieval Europe. Irish monks had preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages, had developed distinctive artistic and theological traditions, and had created a form of Christianity that was deeply integrated with older Celtic spiritual practices. This was not a religion that had been imposed from outside, but one that had grown organically from Irish soil, shaped by centuries of interaction between Christian teaching and ancient Celtic wisdom. The result was a form of Christianity that Vikings found both familiar and deeply unsettling. Irish monks lived in communities that would have been recognizable to any Christian observer. but their monasteries were located at sites that had been sacred to the old gods. Their prayers incorporated elements of druidic ritual, and their understanding of the relationship between the sacred and secular worlds was more fluid and complex than anything in mainstream European Christianity. Perhaps most disturbing to Viking sensibilities was the Irish treatment of death and the afterlife. The Norse had their own complex beliefs about what happened to warriors who died in battle, but these were relatively straightforward compared to the Irish conception of the other world. Irish Christianity had absorbed older Celtic beliefs about the City, the fairy mounds where the spirits of the dead continued their existence in a parallel realm that occasionally intersected with the world of the living. This created a spiritual landscape where the dead were not safely distant in heaven or hell, but remained active participants in the struggles of their descendants. Irish warriors fought, knowing that the spirits of their ancestors were watching, that their courage or cowardice would influence not just their own fate, but the spiritual standing of their entire lineage. They believed that fallen heroes could return to aid their people in times of great need, that the other world was not a distant destination, but a parallel reality that could be accessed through the proper rituals and sacrifices. The legal systems of the two cultures reflected these deeper spiritual differences. Viking law was based on practical considerations: how to maintain order within warrior societies, how to resolve disputes without destroying the groups that depended on cooperation for survival, how to balance individual rights with collective needs. It was a system that could be adapted to different circumstances, that could evolve as Viking society encountered new challenges and opportunities. Irish law, known as the Brehon law, was something far more complex and sacred. It was not simply a set of rules for governing human behaviour, but a reflection of the cosmic order that the gods had established when they first shaped the world. Irish legal scholars, known as brehons, were not just judges but priests who understood the sacred principles that governed all existence. Their decisions were not merely practical solutions to human problems, but attempts to maintain harmony between the human and divine worlds. This difference in legal philosophy created profound misunderstandings between the two cultures. Vikings, operating in Ireland, found themselves subject to legal principles that seemed arbitrary and mystical, while Irish communities under Viking rule struggled to understand a legal system that appeared to ignore the sacred dimensions of justice and social order. The treatment of women provided another area of cultural collision. Viking society, despite its warrior culture, had actually developed relatively progressive attitudes toward women's rights. Norse women could own property, initiate divorce, and participate in business activities with considerable independence. They were respected as the managers of household economies and the guardians of family honour. Irish society had its own traditions of female authority, but these were more closely tied to spiritual and symbolic roles. Irish women could become druids, poets, and seers, wielding considerable influence through their connection to the sacred realm. They could inherit property and serve as regents for minor children, but their power was generally exercised through religious or cultural channels rather than direct political authority. The collision between these different approaches to gender roles created tensions that went beyond individual relationships to affect the broader political dynamics of Irish Viking interaction. Viking men found Irish women's spiritual authority puzzling and sometimes threatening, while Irish men were suspicious of Viking women's economic independence and direct participation in political matters. Marriage customs provided another source of cultural friction. Viking marriage was primarily a practical arrangement designed to create alliances between families and ensure the continuation of bloodlines. While emotional bonds between spouses were certainly valued, the primary purpose of marriage was the production of legitimate heirs and the strengthening of political connections. Irish marriage customs were more complex and ritually significant. Marriage was not just a contract between individuals, but a ceremony that affected the spiritual balance of the communities involved. The bride and groom were not just uniting their personal fates, but joining their ancestral lines, their tutelary spirits, and their connections to the sacred landscape of Ireland. These cultural differences became particularly acute when Vikings and Irish sought to form political alliances through marriage. What appeared to be straightforward dynastic matches often foundered on misunderstandings about the spiritual and social implications of such unions. Viking men who married Irish women found themselves expected to participate in rituals they didn't understand, while Irish women who married Viking leaders discovered that their spiritual authority was not recognized or respected in Norse society. The economic dimensions of the cultural collision were equally significant. Viking society was based on mobility and trade, on the ability to move resources and people across vast distances in response to changing opportunities. Their settlements were designed to be adaptable, their wealth was portable, and their social structures were flexible enough to accommodate rapid changes in circumstances. Irish society was more deeply rooted in place, more dependent on the specific characteristics of particular landscapes and the sacred sites that connected communities to their ancestral past. Irish wealth was not just material, but spiritual, tied to relationships with the land that could not be easily transferred or replaced. Irish social structures were more stable, but also more rigid, based on kinship ties and territorial connections that had been maintained for centuries. The result was two societies that found it difficult to understand each other's motivations and priorities. Vikings could not comprehend why Irish communities would fight so desperately to defend apparently worthless stretches of bog and forest, while the Irish could not understand how the Vikings could treat the sacred landscape of Ireland as merely another resource to be exploited for profit. By the time Brian Boru had united much of Ireland under his leadership, these cultural differences had created a situation where compromise or accommodation was becoming increasingly impossible. The Vikings and Irish had lived in proximity for over 2 centuries, had intermarried, had fought alongside each other in various conflicts, and had developed extensive trade relationships. Yet they remained fundamentally alien to each other, separated by differences in worldview that made peaceful coexistence increasingly difficult. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be about more than territorial control or political dominance. The coming battle would be a test of which cultural system was better adapted to the realities of medieval Ireland, which vision of society could command the loyalty and sacrifice needed to prevail in the ultimate crisis. At Clontarf, these incompatible worldviews would collide in a single day of bloodshed that would determine not just the political future of Ireland, but the cultural identity of its people. Brian Boru had spent decades preparing for this moment, not just building armies and forging alliances, but creating a new synthesis of Irish tradition and practical necessity that could meet the Viking challenge on its own terms. The Norse, for their part, had recognised that their entire position in Ireland was at stake and had marshalled resources from across their Atlantic empire for what they knew would be a final test of their power. The collision of these two worlds would soon produce the most decisive battle in Irish history, a confrontation that would echo through the centuries and determine whether Ireland would remain a land of competing kingdoms or emerge as a unified nation capable of defending its independence against any future threat. Part 6. The Battle of Clontarf. The year was 1014, and Brian Boru had reached the age of 73. By medieval standards, he was an ancient man, his hair white as snow, his once powerful frame bent by decades of warfare and the weight of kingship. Yet his mind remained sharp, his determination undiminished, and his strategic vision clearer than ever. He understood that the coming confrontation would be his last campaign, the final test of everything he had worked to achieve over nearly 4 decades of struggle. The immediate cause of the crisis was a rebellion by Sigtryg Silkbeard, the Norse king of Dublin, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Brian's dominance over Irish affairs. Sigtryg had initially accepted Brian's overlordship, paying tribute and acknowledging the Irish High King's authority. But as Brian's power grew and his demands for integration increased, the Viking leader began to chafe under what he saw as unacceptable restrictions on his independence. The breaking point came when Brian demanded that Sigtryg divorce his Irish wife, Gormlaith, who had been Brian's own wife before their political marriage dissolved into bitter enmity. Gormlaith was a woman of fierce ambition and considerable political skill, a former queen who had never accepted her reduced status under Brian's new order. She had been working quietly to undermine Brian's authority, using her connections with both Irish and Viking leaders to build a coalition that could challenge the High King's dominance. Sigtryg's refusal to comply with Brian's demands provided the spark that ignited the final confrontation, but this was not simply a personal dispute between rival leaders. Both sides understood that the stakes were nothing less than the future of Ireland itself. If Brian could crush this rebellion, his vision of a unified Irish kingdom would be secure. If Sigtryg could defeat the High King, the Viking settlements would regain their independence, and the dream of Irish unity would die with its architect. The scale of the forces that began to gather for this ultimate confrontation reflected the international significance of the conflict. Sigtryg had sent messengers across the Viking world, calling for aid from every Norse leader who had a stake in maintaining Viking power in Ireland. The response was extraordinary, demonstrating the extent to which the Vikings viewed Brian's success as a threat to their entire Atlantic empire. From the Orkney Islands came Earl Sigurd the Stout, one of the most powerful Viking leaders in the North Atlantic, bringing with him a force of seasoned warriors who had fought in conflicts from Scotland to Iceland. From the Isle of Man came Brodir, a Viking chieftain whose fierce reputation had made him a legend among the Norse settlements. From the Hebrides and the Scottish Islands came additional contingents, each led by Jarls, who understood that Brian's victory would inspire similar resistance movements throughout the Viking world. Most significantly, the legendary warrior Brodir had brought with him a raven banner that was said to possess supernatural powers. According to Norse tradition, this banner would bring victory to the army that fought beneath it, but death to the man who carried it. The very presence of this mystical standard demonstrated the extent to which the Vikings viewed the coming battle as a struggle that would determine the fate of their entire presence in the Celtic world. The Irish forces that rallied to Brian's cause were equally impressive in their scope and determination. From every kingdom that had acknowledged Brian's overlordship came contingents of warriors eager to participate in what they understood would be the decisive battle of their generation. The Fianna, those elite warrior bands who had perfected the art of Irish warfare, arrived in numbers that had not been seen since the legendary battles of Irish mythology. Brian's own son, Murchad, commanded a significant portion of the Irish forces, leading warriors from Munster who had been fighting the Vikings for decades. From Connacht came additional forces under the leadership of kings who had initially resisted Brian's authority, but now recognised that their own survival depended on his success. Even from the northern kingdoms, traditional enemies of Munster expansion, came contingents of warriors who understood that the Viking threat transcended ancient Irish rivalries. The location chosen for this climactic confrontation was itself symbolically significant. The battle would take place at Clontarf, on the shores of Dublin Bay, within sight of the Viking settlement that had served as the centre of Norse power in Ireland for over 150 years. This was not neutral ground, but the very heartland of Viking influence, the place where Sigtrygg's ancestors had first established their foothold in Ireland. The date was equally meaningful: Good Friday, April 23, 1014. The choice of this sacred day was deliberate, reflecting the religious dimensions of the conflict. Brian had positioned himself as a Christian king fighting against pagan enemies, despite the fact that many of the Vikings were also nominally Christian. The symbolism was clear. Just as Christ had sacrificed himself for the salvation of humanity, Brian was prepared to give his life to secure the freedom of Ireland. The night before the battle, both armies made their final preparations with the solemnity appropriate to such a momentous occasion. In the Irish camp, bards sang the ancient songs that connected the warriors to their heroic ancestors, while priests offered prayers for victory and blessed the weapons that would be carried into battle. Brian himself spent much of the night in prayer, knowing that this would likely be his final campaign. In the Viking camp, the atmosphere was equally charged with anticipation and religious fervour. The Norse warriors performed their own pre-battle rituals, making offerings to their gods and preparing themselves for what they understood might be their last fight. The presence of the Raven banner added an element of supernatural dread to the proceedings, as warriors contemplated the prophecy that victory would come at the cost of their standard-bearer's life. As dawn broke on Good Friday, the two armies began to deploy for battle. The field at Clontarf was relatively flat ground that seemed to favour the Viking style of warfare, with its emphasis on disciplined shield walls and coordinated attacks. But Brian had not survived 4 decades of warfare without learning to adapt to different circumstances. He had developed tactics specifically designed to counter Viking advantages while maximising Irish strengths. The Irish deployment reflected Brian's strategic innovation. Rather than forming a single battle line that could be broken by a concentrated Viking charge, he arranged his forces in multiple layers, with each contingent prepared to support the others in a flexible defensive system. The Fianna were positioned at key points where their superior individual skills could be most effective, while the larger formations of kingdom warriors were arranged to provide mutual support and prevent any single breakthrough from becoming decisive. Brian himself took a position behind the main battle line, not out of cowardice, but in recognition of his strategic importance. At 73, he was no longer the warrior who had fought in the front ranks during his youth, but he remained the irreplaceable leader whose presence was essential for maintaining Irish unity. His tent was positioned where he could observe the entire battle and coordinate the complex manoeuvres that would be necessary for victory. The Viking deployment was more conventional but no less formidable. Earl Sigurd commanded the centre, with his Orkney warriors forming a disciplined wedge that was designed to break through the Irish lines at their strongest point. Brodier and his men from the Isle of Man took position on the Viking right, where their fierce reputation was intended to intimidate the Irish forces facing them. The Dublin Vikings and their Irish allies formed the left wing, with Sigtrygg himself commanding this portion of the army. The battle began with the ritual exchanges that were traditional in medieval warfare. Champions from both sides stepped forward to issue challenges and boast of their prowess, while the main armies worked themselves into the psychological state necessary for the carnage that was about to begin. The Irish war cries echoed across the field, answered by the Viking battle roars that had struck terror into enemies across Europe. When the fighting finally began, it was with an intensity that surpassed even the most experienced warriors' expectations. The initial Viking charge, led by Earl Sigurd's Orkney men, struck the Irish centre with devastating force. The disciplined advance of the Viking shield wall, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun, their battle cries drowning out all other sounds, created a spectacle that would have broken the morale of lesser opponents. But the Irish had been preparing for this moment for years. They absorbed the initial shock of the Viking assault, giving ground gradually while maintaining their formation. The Fianna, positioned at critical points along the line, struck back with individual acts of heroism that began to disrupt the Viking advance. Irish warriors, drawing on generations of experience in fighting the Norse, began to exploit the small gaps and weaknesses that appeared in the enemy formation. The battle's first phase lasted for several hours, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. The Vikings pushed forward with their characteristic determination, but the Irish defence held firm, adapting to each new assault with the tactical flexibility that had made them such effective opponents. The fighting was brutal and personal, with warriors on both sides demonstrating the kind of courage that had made this conflict legendary. As the morning wore on, the tide began to turn in favour of the Irish. The Viking forces, fighting far from their home bases and supply lines, began to show signs of exhaustion. The Irish, fighting for their homeland and inspired by Brian's presence, seemed to draw strength from the very ground beneath their feet. The complex tactical system that Brian had developed began to pay dividends, as Irish contingents supported each other in ways that the Vikings had not anticipated. The decisive moment came when Earl Sigurd, carrying the mystical raven banner, was killed in fierce hand-to-hand combat with Irish warriors. The death of this key Viking leader, combined with the loss of their sacred standard, created a psychological shock that rippled through the entire Norse army. The prophecy associated with the banner had been fulfilled. Victory was slipping away from the Vikings, and their standard-bearer had paid the ultimate price. But even as the Irish forces began to sense victory, tragedy struck their own ranks. Brodir, the fierce Viking chieftain from the Isle of Man, had led a small band of warriors in a desperate flanking attack that penetrated deep into the Irish rear areas. Their objective was not military victory, which was now clearly impossible, but the assassination of Brian Boru himself. The attack on Brian's tent was the climax of the entire battle. The aged High King, despite his years, took up his sword to defend himself when Brodir and his men burst through the guard that had been protecting him. The fight was brief but desperate, with Brian demonstrating that his warrior skills had not entirely deserted him despite his advanced age. He wounded Brodir severely, but the Viking chieftain's dying blow struck down the man who had united Ireland. The death of Brian Boru created a moment of profound crisis for the Irish forces. Their great leader, the architect of their unity, the symbol of their resistance to Viking domination, lay dead in his tent. For a brief moment, it seemed that the entire Irish effort might collapse, that the carefully constructed alliance that Brian had built over decades might shatter in the face of this devastating loss. But the Irish warriors had been too thoroughly transformed by Brian's leadership to simply abandon the field. His son Murchad, though mortally wounded in the fighting, continued to command the Munster contingent with inspiring courage. The other Irish leaders, recognising that Brian's death made their own survival even more dependent on achieving victory, pressed their attacks with renewed determination. The Viking forces, meanwhile, had been shattered by the loss of their key leaders, and the collapse of their tactical formations. Sigtryg, seeing that the battle was lost, attempted to rally his remaining forces for a final stand. But the psychological impact of the Irish resistance, combined with the heavy casualties they had suffered, made organised resistance impossible. The final phase of the battle was more slaughter than organised combat. The surviving Vikings, many of them wounded and demoralised, attempted to retreat toward their ships anchored in Dublin Bay. But the Irish pursuit was relentless, driven by years of accumulated anger and the knowledge that this was their opportunity to end the Viking threat once and for all. The pursuit continued onto the beach itself, where Vikings attempting to reach their longships were cut down in the surf. The tide was coming in, and many wounded warriors drowned in the rising water, their blood mixing with the salt spray to create a crimson foam that would be remembered in Irish songs for generations. The very elements seemed to have turned against the Vikings, with the sea that had carried them to Ireland now becoming their grave. When the slaughter finally ended, the field of Clontarf was littered with the bodies of warriors from across the Viking world. Earl Sigurd of Orkney lay dead, his raven banner torn and bloodied beside him. Brodir of Man had died in Brian's tent, his assassination of the Irish king his final act. Hundreds of other Viking warriors, men who had terrorised coastlines from Iceland to Sicily, would never return to their homes. The Irish losses were equally heavy, but somehow more meaningful. Brian Boru himself was dead, struck down at the moment of his greatest triumph. His son Murchad had died of his wounds, along with many of the finest warriors of Munster. The Fianna had fought with such desperate courage that entire companies had been wiped out, their names remembered only in the songs that would commemorate their sacrifice. Yet, despite these losses, the Irish had achieved something unprecedented. They had broken Viking power in Ireland permanently. Never again would the Norse be able to threaten Irish independence. The settlements at Dublin, Cork and Waterford would survive, but as trading posts rather than military bases, their inhabitants gradually integrating into Irish society rather than maintaining their separate identity. The psychological impact of Clontarf extended far beyond Ireland itself. Throughout the Viking world, the news of the defeat sent shockwaves through communities that had never known such a comprehensive disaster. The myth of Viking invincibility, carefully cultivated over 2 centuries of successful expansion, had been shattered by an enemy that had learned to turn their own strengths against them. More importantly, the battle had demonstrated that unified resistance could succeed against even the most formidable enemies. The example of Brian Boru's success would inspire similar movements throughout the Celtic world, as Welsh and Scottish leaders recognised that the Viking threat could be defeated by those who combined traditional warrior values with strategic innovation. The immediate aftermath of the battle was chaotic, with both sides struggling to come to terms with what had occurred. The surviving Irish leaders had to deal with the succession crisis created by Brian's death, while the remaining Vikings faced the collapse of their entire position in Ireland. Yet even in the midst of this confusion, it was clear that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the two cultures. The long struggle that had begun with the first Viking raids in 795 had finally ended, not with accommodation or compromise, but with the decisive victory of one side over the other. The Irish had proven that their homeland could be defended, that their culture could survive, and that their vision of society was stronger than the Viking alternative. But the victory had come at an enormous cost. Brian Boru, the architect of Irish unity, was dead. Many of the finest warriors of his generation had perished alongside him. The political structures he had created would face severe challenges in the years to come. The question that remained was whether the Irish could preserve the unity he had forged, or whether his death would lead to a return to the fragmentation that had made Viking expansion possible in the first place. The Battle of Clontarf had ended, but its consequences would echo through Irish history for centuries to come. The warriors who had made even the Vikings' run had proven their worth in the ultimate test, but the greater challenge of building a lasting peace would prove even more difficult than winning the war itself. Part 7. The Fading of the Longships. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Ireland faced a crisis that threatened to undo everything Brian Boru had achieved. The High King was dead, struck down at the moment of his greatest triumph. His son Murchad, who might have provided continuity of leadership, had also perished in the fighting. The carefully constructed alliance that had made victory possible was suddenly without the central figure who had held it together for decades. The surviving Irish leaders faced a choice that would determine the future of their island. They could return to the old patterns of rivalry and competition that had made Viking expansion possible in the first place, or they could find a way to preserve the unity that Brian had forged. The decision was not made in royal councils or through formal negotiations, but in the hearts of warriors who had fought alongside men from distant kingdoms and discovered that they shared more than they had ever imagined. The immediate succession fell to Brian's brother, Donald, but he was already an old man who lacked his brother's charisma and strategic vision. More importantly, the other Irish kings had not followed Brian simply because of his personal authority, but because his leadership had offered them something they had never experienced before: the possibility of a truly unified Ireland that could defend itself against any external threat. The lesson of Clontarf was not lost on the surviving Irish leaders. They had seen what could be accomplished when Irish kingdoms worked together, when the ancient warrior traditions of their people were coordinated and directed toward a common goal. The alternative, a return to the fragmentation that had made them vulnerable to Viking expansion, was no longer acceptable to men who had tasted the pride of decisive victory. Yet even as the Irish struggled to maintain their unity, the Vikings who had survived the battle were facing their own crisis of confidence and purpose. The defeat at Clontarf had not just been a military disaster, but a psychological catastrophe that challenged the very foundations of Viking identity. For over 2 centuries, the Norse had built their reputation on an image of invincibility, a carefully cultivated myth that they were the chosen warriors of the gods, destined to conquer and rule wherever they chose to land. The comprehensive nature of their defeat in Ireland shattered this myth in ways that would have far-reaching consequences throughout the Viking world. The news of Clontarf spread rapidly through the Norse settlements, carried by survivors who brought tales of an enemy that had turned their own strengths against them, of Irish warriors who had fought with a fury that matched their own, of a land that had refused to be conquered despite centuries of pressure. The psychological impact was particularly severe among the younger generation of Vikings, those who had grown up hearing stories of their ancestors' great victories and assuming that similar triumphs awaited them. The defeat in Ireland forced them to confront the reality that the age of easy conquest was ending, that they would need to find new ways to make their mark on the world. In the Viking settlements that remained in Ireland, the mood was one of resignation and gradual accommodation. Sigtrygg Silkbeard, who had survived the battle, found himself ruling a much reduced Dublin that was now clearly subordinate to Irish authority. The other Norse settlements faced similar situations, forced to accept that their days as independent powers were over. But rather than fleeing Ireland or maintaining bitter resistance, many of the surviving Vikings began to adapt to their new circumstances in ways that would have surprised their ancestors. They married into Irish families, adopted Irish customs, and gradually integrated into the society they had once sought to conquer. The process was not immediate or complete, But over the course of several generations, the descendants of Viking settlers became indistinguishable from their Irish neighbours. This transformation was facilitated by the Irish approach to victory. Rather than seeking to exterminate or expel the Viking population, the Irish leaders chose a policy of integration and assimilation. They recognised that the Norse settlers had brought valuable skills and knowledge to Ireland, particularly in the areas of trade, craftsmanship, and urban development. The challenge was to preserve these benefits while ensuring that the Viking military threat could never again threaten Irish independence. The result was a gradual blending of cultures that enriched both Irish and Viking traditions. The cities that had begun as Viking settlements evolved into centres of Irish commerce and culture, retaining their international connections while becoming firmly integrated into Irish society. The descendants of Viking warriors became Irish merchants, craftsmen, and even warriors in the service of Irish kings. The broader impact of Clontarf extended far beyond Ireland itself. Throughout the Viking world, the defeat forced a fundamental reassessment of Norse strategy and ambitions. The easy victories that had characterized the early Viking expansion were clearly becoming more difficult to achieve as the peoples of Europe learned to organize effective resistance against Norse attacks. In England, where Danish kingdoms had established themselves as permanent powers, the news of Clontarf encouraged English resistance movements and contributed to the eventual restoration of native English rule. In Scotland, where Norse influence had been strong in the islands and highlands, local leaders began to emulate Brian Boru's example, organising unified resistance against Viking expansion. Even in areas where Vikings had achieved more complete success, such as Normandy and the Rus principalities, the psychological impact of Clontarf was significant. The myth of Viking invincibility, which had been a crucial element in their ability to dominate larger populations, was permanently damaged by the comprehensive nature of their Irish defeat. The transformation of Viking society, in response to Clontarf, was not just military but cultural. The age of the pure raider, seeking wealth and glory through violence and conquest, was giving way to a more complex Viking identity that emphasized trade, settlement, and integration with local populations. This was not necessarily a conscious choice, but a practical adaptation to a world where the old methods were no longer reliably successful. The impact on Irish society was equally profound, though more positive. The victory at Clontarf had demonstrated that Irish unity was not just possible, but tremendously powerful when properly organised and directed. This realisation would influence Irish political development for centuries, creating a template for resistance that would be invoked whenever Ireland faced external threats. The memory of Brian Boru became central to Irish identity in ways that transcended his actual historical achievements. He was remembered not just as a successful war leader, but as the architect of Irish unity, the king who had shown that the Irish could defend their homeland against any enemy if they could overcome their internal divisions. This memory would inspire future generations of Irish leaders, from medieval kings to modern nationalist movements. The cultural legacy of the Irish victory was preserved and transmitted through the bardic traditions that had been such an important part of Irish warrior culture. The songs and stories that commemorated Clontarf became part of the shared heritage of the Irish people, ensuring that the lessons of Brian's success would not be forgotten. These tales emphasised not just the military aspects of the victory, but the political and cultural innovations that had made it possible. The transformation of Ireland after Clontarf was gradual but unmistakable. The island that had been characterised by political fragmentation and vulnerability to external threats began to develop a stronger sense of unified identity. While the old kingdoms and tribal divisions persisted, they were now overlaid with a new understanding of what it meant to be Irish, an identity that had been forged in the crucible of resistance to Viking expansion. The economic development that followed the victory was equally significant. With the Viking threat eliminated, Irish trade could develop along new lines that favoured Irish merchants and craftsmen rather than Norse middlemen. The cities that had been established as Viking settlements evolved into centres of Irish commerce, their international connections preserved but redirected to serve Irish interests rather than Viking expansion. The religious and cultural renaissance that followed Clontarf reflected the increased confidence of Irish society. The monasteries that had been repeatedly attacked during the Viking Age entered a period of renewed prosperity and intellectual activity. Irish art, literature, and scholarship flourished as the island's cultural institutions were freed from the constant threat of Viking raids. Perhaps most importantly, the victory at Clontarf established a precedent that would influence Irish responses to future threats. The island had learned that unity was not just desirable, but essential for survival in a hostile world. This lesson would be invoked repeatedly throughout Irish history, whenever external powers threatened to impose their will on the Irish people. The fading of the longships from Irish waters was not immediate or complete, but it was irreversible. The great age of Viking expansion that had begun with the raids on Lindisfarne and Rathlin Island was coming to an end, not through exhaustion or external pressure, but through the simple reality that the methods that had brought success in the 9th century were no longer viable in the 11th. The Vikings who remained in Ireland did so as settlers rather than conquerors, as participants in Irish society rather than its masters. Their descendants would fight for Irish kings, marry into Irish families, and gradually lose the distinct cultural identity that had once made them the terror of Europe. The longships that had carried them to Ireland would rot in forgotten harbours, their crews finding new lives in the land they had once sought to conquer. In the broader context of European history, the Irish victory at Clontarf marked a turning point in the relationship between the established peoples of Europe and the Norse expansionists who had dominated the early medieval period. The age of easy Viking conquest was ending, replaced by a more complex era where success required adaptation, integration, and cooperation with local populations rather than simple military dominance. The warriors who had made even the Vikings' run had accomplished something unprecedented in their time. They had shown that the seemingly unstoppable forces of the age could be defeated by those who combined traditional values with strategic innovation, who understood that the defense of homeland required not just individual courage, but collective action, who recognized that cultural identity was worth fighting for, even at the cost of individual lives. The story of the Irish resistance to Viking expansion is ultimately a story about the power of determined people to defend their way of life against seemingly impossible odds. It demonstrates that technological superiority, military prowess, and international networks are not enough to guarantee success if the people being conquered refuse to accept defeat and are willing to adapt their methods to meet new challenges. The ghosts of the longships that once terrorized Irish coasts serve as a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is permanent. The Vikings, who had conquered half of Europe, discovered in Ireland that there are some things that cannot be taken by force, some peoples who will not be subdued, some cultures that will find a way to survive and flourish despite the most determined efforts to destroy them. In the end, the Emerald Isle that had seemed so vulnerable to Viking expansion proved to be their graveyard, the place where their dreams of conquest died and their warriors learned the hard lesson that even the most fearsome predators can become prey when they venture into the wrong territory. The Irish had not just defended their homeland, they had preserved their identity, their culture, and their independence for future generations. The Battle of Clontarf was over, but its legacy would endure. The warriors who had made even the Vikings run had earned their place in the pantheon of history's greatest defenders, their story a testament to the power of unity, determination, and the unbreakable spirit of those who fight for their homeland. Their victory would echo through the centuries, inspiring future generations with the knowledge that freedom is always worth fighting for, and that no enemy, no matter how formidable, is truly invincible. The longships had faded from Irish waters, but the memory of those who defeated them would live forever.